Your dog just did something ridiculous. Maybe it slipped on the kitchen floor. Maybe it ran full speed into a glass door. Maybe it tried to jump onto the couch, completely misjudged the distance and just didn't make it. And in the half second after it happened, the dog did something interesting. It looked around, not at the floor, not at the door, not at the couch, around. As in, did anyone see that? You've probably laughed at this. Most people do. It looks almost exactly like what a human does after tripping in public. That same quick scan, that same split second of hoping nobody noticed, and then you move on. Because obviously the dog isn't actually embarrassed. Animals don't feel embarrassed. That's a human thing, a social thing, a thing that requires a specific kind of self-awareness that animals just don't have. Except, scientists have spent decades studying exactly that assumption, and what they found should make you considerably less certain. Here's why embarrassment is such a strange emotion to study. Most basic emotions, fear, pain, hunger, attachment, are ancient. They exist across hundreds of species because they solve basic survival problems. Being afraid of predators keeps you alive. Hunger drives you to eat. These emotions are, in evolutionary terms, cheap and practical. Embarrassment is different. It requires at least three things happening simultaneously in the brain. First, you have to know that you exist as a separate entity, that there is a you that can be perceived from the outside. Second, you have to understand that other individuals have minds that are currently forming opinions about you. You need a working theory of what someone else is thinking. Third, and this is the part that makes embarrassment so sophisticated, you have to care about that opinion. You have to want to be seen in a specific way, and notice when that image has been damaged. Psychologists call this category a self-conscious emotion. Embarrassment, shame, pride, guilt. Emotions that are not just responses to the world, but responses to how the world sees you. For decades, the scientific consensus was that self-conscious emotions were uniquely human, that they required a level of self-awareness that simply didn't exist in other animals. Then researchers started actually watching them. You know the look, you come home, something has been destroyed, a cushion, a shoe, a bin of food that no longer exists, and your dog is not acting like a dog who had a perfectly normal afternoon. Head low, eyes averted, ears back, body slightly hunched, tail moving in that specific uncertain way that is somehow both wagging and not wagging. The guilty look. Most dog owners see this and think, they know what they did. They feel bad about it, maybe even embarrassed. In 2009, researcher Alexandra Horowitz at Barnard College ran a study to test whether this was true. She set up an experiment. Owners told their dogs not to eat a treat, then left the room. Some dogs ate the treat, some didn't. Then the owners returned. But here's the twist. Some owners were told their dog had eaten the treat, when it actually hadn't. Some were told their dog had been good, when it had actually eaten the treat. The owners who believed their dog had misbehaved greeted their dog in a scolding manner. The owners who believed their dog had been good greeted warmly. And the dogs who showed the guiltiest, most embarrassed-looking behavior were the innocent ones. The dogs who had actually eaten the treat and whose owners greeted them warmly showed almost no guilty behavior at all. The guilty look had nothing to do with what the dog had done. It was a response to the owner's body language, to a perceived threat, to the social signal of a displeased human. Not guilt, not embarrassment, just a sophisticated social survival strategy, which, if you think about it, might actually require even more social intelligence than embarrassment would, because chimpanzees don't have owners scolding them in labs. And what researchers have documented in chimpanzee social groups is considerably harder to explain away. Chimpanzees live in strict social hierarchies. Status is everything. How others perceive you, other chimps specifically, directly determines your access to food, mates, and protection. Being seen failing at something socially visible isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. Frans de Waal, one of the world's leading primatologists, documented something in his decades of observation that he described as audience-dependent behavior. When a chimpanzee stumbled, fell, or made a visible social error, their behavior changed immediately depending on whether other chimpanzees had witnessed it. When witnessed, the chimpanzee would engage in specific behaviors that primatologists describe as face-saving, exaggerated displays of confidence, redirected aggression onto something nearby, quick grooming of themselves as if nothing had happened, active attempts to restore a specific social image. When not witnessed, none of this occurred. The animal was not just responding to the event, it was responding to being seen. It was managing its reputation. In 2011, researchers published findings on what they called the audience effect in great apes. Chimpanzees and orangutans changed their displays, their expressions, and their behavior based on whether they were being observed, and by whom. They didn't just care that they were being watched, they cared about who was doing the watching. A dominant chimpanzee watching generated a different response than a subordinate one. A familiar observer generated a different response than a stranger. This This is not a simple stimulus response. This is social calculation. Here's the part that nobody quite says out loud. Embarrassment requires something very specific. It requires caring about your social image. And the reason that's significant is this. You cannot care about your social image unless you have a social image to care about. You cannot have a social image unless other individuals form mental representations of you. You cannot respond to those mental representations unless you have some model of what others are thinking. Which means embarrassment, if it exists in animals, is not just evidence of emotion. It's evidence of theory of mind. The understanding that other minds exist and that those minds are currently forming opinions about you. In 2017, researchers at the University of Zurich studied how Barbary macaques responded to social failure. When a macaque lost a fight or failed at a social challenge in front of observers, the animal showed elevated stress hormones, which you'd expect. But they also showed behaviors directed specifically at the audience. Attempts to redirect attention. Self-directed behaviors that primatologists associate with social anxiety. These were not responses to the failure itself. They were responses to being watched failing. The distinction is everything. A dog that flinches when you raise your voice is responding to threat. An animal that checks whether anyone saw it fail and then actively attempts to manage how it is perceived. That animal has a social self. And a social self is not far from the thing at the center of every question this channel keeps asking. Whether there is something it is like to be them. Now here's what makes this even harder to dismiss. You might remember the mirror test from another video on this channel. Researchers place a mark on an animal's face while it's unconscious. Then they give it a mirror. If the animal looks in the mirror and touches the mark on its own body, it understands the reflection is them. Chimpanzees pass. Dolphins pass. Elephants pass. Eurasian magpies pass. But here's what most people don't know about the mirror test. When researchers marked the faces of chimpanzees and then gave them access to a mirror, the chimps didn't just touch the mark. They immediately turned away from other chimpanzees. They hid. They retreated to private spaces and examined themselves where no one could watch. They didn't just recognize themselves. They recognized that they had been altered in a way that others could see. And they didn't want to be seen until they had fixed it. That's not self-recognition anymore. That's self-consciousness. That's caring about your appearance in the eyes of others. That's a precursor to embarrassment so clear that researchers have started calling it exactly that, proto-embarrassment. A social emotion that exists in the gap between knowing who you are and knowing that others are watching. And here's where the science hits its wall. We can measure the behavior. We can document the hiding, the face-saving, the audience awareness. What we cannot do is get inside the experience and confirm that it feels like anything. The hard problem of consciousness again. The inner texture of embarrassment, the hot face, the wishing the floor would swallow you sensation, that remains locked behind eyes we can't see through. But if it looks like social awareness, if it measures like reputation management, if it only happens when there are witnesses, maybe the behavior is the emotion, or at least the only part of it we're ever going to be able to prove. There is a video that circulates occasionally among primatologists. A young chimpanzee, call him Kai, was attempting to open a container in front of several adult chimpanzees and researchers. He struggled for about 40 seconds, failing repeatedly. The adults in the group showed no reaction, which in chimpanzee social terms is itself a meaningful response, neutral observation. And then Kai did something. He stopped, sat back, looked at the container, looked at the watching adults, then looked away from the container entirely, at something on the far side of the enclosure, and made a confident noise toward it. As if whatever was over there was far more interesting than this container he definitely wasn't struggling with. The container remained unopened. His audience watched this redirect for a few seconds and then looked away. And the moment they looked away, Kai immediately went back to the container and kept trying. Nobody in the field of primate behavior who has watched that video calls what happened their instinct. That was planning. That was audience awareness. That was the management of a social image in real time to protect status. Whether Kai felt embarrassed in any way that resembles what you feel when you trip in public, nobody can say for certain. The hard problem is still the hard problem. But he knew he was being watched. He knew that failing in front of witnesses was different from failing alone. He had a self that could be perceived, and he cared about how it looked. The dog on the kitchen floor, the chimp in the enclosure, the human tripping on the sidewalk, same quick glance, same split-second calculation, same ancient, deeply social fear of being seen failing. Maybe the difference between us and them isn't that they can't feel embarrassed. Maybe it's that we've just gotten better at pretending we didn't. And maybe the next time your dog wipes out on the kitchen floor and does that quick scan around the room, you shouldn't laugh. Maybe you should just look away. Give them the same thing you'd want someone to give you. The quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that yes, you saw it. And no, you're not going to make it worse by letting them know.